Hello, my name is Alejandro Quiñones, and this is my Theory of Knowledge, Ways of Knowing Summative Assessment. The original question for this summative assessment was, ways of knowing are a check on our instinctive judgments. To what extent do you agree with this statement? I rephrased the question slightly in order to answer it more easily, as, how are the ways of knowing a check on our instinctive judgments? I also defined my terms in order to begin to answer the question. Ways of knowing. Ways of knowing are a means by which knowers acquire knowledge. These include faith, reason, imagination, memory, language, emotion, intuition, and perception. Instinctive judgments can be defined as reflexive or immediate reactions. A check can be a number of things. It can be a limit, an outline, or simply something that causes concern for a knower. In this video, I'll be arguing that reason, which is the process by which judgments are formed based on logic, can and should be a check on instinctive judgments. I'll be using two different real-life examples in order to make this argument. Firstly, I'll be talking about Republican voters in Alabama. Alabama is one of the most conservative Republican states in the United States. A Gallup poll conducted in 2015 shows that 51% of Alabamians say they are Republicans or lean Republican, while only 34% say they are Democrats. On December 12, 2017, there was a special election held in the state of Alabama to replace former U.S. Senator and current Attorney General Jeff Sessions. This election was between Republican Roy Moore and Democrat Doug Jones. Moore is a former state Supreme Court justice, and Doug Jones is a former U.S. attorney. A few weeks before the election, a woman came forward accusing Moore of making sexual advances towards her when he was 32 and she was only 14. A number of other women have since come forward accusing Moore of sexual assault. In a poll taken after the first woman came forward, 42% of probable Moore voters have reservations about voting for him, while only 28% of probable Jones voters have reservations about voting for Jones. Also, 75% of Moore voters strongly support him, while 90% of Jones voters strongly support Jones. Many Republican voters in Alabama have reasoned that Moore's sexual misconduct charges put his character in question, which is why many have refused to support him strongly. Therefore, the Republican conservatives use reason as a check against their instincts, which are to support or vote for the Republican candidate based solely on their paradigm or worldview. In this case, reason is only a check that works to cause concern within some Republicans' minds, because almost 90% of Republicans still ended up voting for Moore in the election. The second example I'll be talking about is views of African American communities. Conservative intellectual and economist Thomas Sowell said, "Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get the sense of superiority by denouncing others as racists." Sowell is saying that racism is mostly dead in America and is kept alive by those who claim that racism is still present. This quote represents a large sentiment in conservative America, which is that racism is dead due to the fact that African Americans acquired the same legal rights as white Americans after the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. While it is true that under the law African Americans and white Americans are equal, the truth about racism is far more complex. Racist Jim Crow laws that were implemented in the South post-Civil War established segregation in all government facilities. Also, violence against African Americans was common, and voting rights were heavily restricted during this period known as Reconstruction. This discrimination forced middle-class African Americans to move to the North during the early to mid-20th century. Many of these people were forced to live in terrible housing because banks refused to give mortgages to African Americans based solely on the color of their skin through a process called redlining. Also, they were rarely given loans by banks to start small businesses through the same process. More recently, banks targeted African Americans in giving them subprime mortgages, which had abnormally high interest rates before the 2008 housing crisis, in a process called reverse redlining. These processes have limited opportunities within African American communities in finding housing, starting businesses, and achieving stable financial futures. A poll done by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago showed that almost 55% of white Americans think that African Americans face more poverty due to a lack of motivation and willpower rather than discriminatory policies. When this group of conservatives discount racism as a large problem, they should consider these policies, such as redlining and reverse redlining, that have had a negative effect on African American socioeconomic status. They should therefore use reason as a check against their instinctive judgments, which are to view African Americans as unmotivated to seek better lives. Thank you.